Hey all, so this is going to be a quick video about evaluating arguments. So we just learned how to identify the parts of arguments, how to find the conclusion and differentiate it from the premises. Today, just a quick one on evaluating arguments. So a note on evaluating. So the root word there is value. So when we're evaluating arguments, we're trying to figure out if they're good arguments or if they're bad arguments. So what's the value of the argument in front of us? Should it lead us to believe the conclusion? So let's talk about two of the most common ways that arguments can go wrong. Let's look at some examples to do that. So first, premise one, either George W. Bush or Bill Clinton was president on 9/11/01. George W. Bush wasn't president, therefore Bill Clinton was president. So something's very obviously wrong with this argument. The problem with it is that premise two, that George W. Bush wasn't president on 9/11/01, is just false. So it leads us to a conclusion that we probably shouldn't believe. But even if the conclusion were true, if an argument has a false premise, then the way it's trying to get us to believe that conclusion is bad, so it's a bad argument in itself. So one way that an argument can go wrong is if it just has a false premise. So how would you know that? The way you do that is just by looking up the information. So if you didn't have the relevant background knowledge, you would just Google who was president on 9/11/01, and you'd see that George W. Bush was president then. So you'd know that premise two of this argument was false. Then let's look at another argument. So this argument goes, Steph Curry is the greatest shooter in NBA history. Therefore, Steph Curry is the greatest player in NBA history. So this argument, I want to say there's something wrong with it, but it goes wrong in a different way than the first argument. Recall in the first argument, it had a premise that was false. In this argument, the only premise is Steph Curry is the greatest shooter in NBA history. Now you might be thinking that premise could be contentious, like it's a bold claim to say he's the greatest shooter in NBA history, but actually if you talk to basketball experts, it's not all that contentious. So people who know the game are pretty much in agreement that he's the greatest shooter in NBA history. So the problem with this argument won't be that it has a false premise, because there's only one premise and then the conclusion. The problem with this argument, because we might suspect that the conclusion is not true. So what must have gone wrong if the premise is not true? Well, it must be that even if the premise is true, which I contend that it is, that the premise doesn't give us enough reason by itself to believe the conclusion. So even if he's the greatest shooter in NBA history, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's the greatest player in NBA history, and it might not even make it probable that he's the greatest player in NBA history. Because if you have some background knowledge about basketball, you know, while shooting a high percentage, while making more shots than you miss, and doing that at a historic rate even, is very important to being a great basketball player in the NBA. It's not the only thing it takes to be the greatest player in NBA history. There's no mention of defense here. There's no mention of how good of a passer he is, how good of a dribbler he is, how well he plays in a team concept. And while he does many of those things really well, even excellently, so sorry again for all this Steph Curry Warrior stuff. You got to deal with it. While he does many of those things very well, and he may very well be the greatest shooter in NBA history, this argument just tries to jump from the claim that he's the greatest shooter in NBA history to he's the greatest player in NBA history. And what we might say is, even if that premise is true, it doesn't give us enough reason to think that the conclusion is even likely to be true. All right, so with those two examples in mind, let's talk about the two questions that you need to ask of arguments to figure out if they're good or bad arguments. The first is, if the premises were true, would they provide enough support for the conclusion? So would they give us by themselves enough reason to believe the conclusion? And I put a PFT there. So what this is called is in some textbooks is the proper form test. So in order to pass the proper form test, it needs to be the case that if the premises were true, they would provide enough support for the conclusion. The second argument that we looked at failed this criteria. So even if that premise is true, that Steph is the greatest shooter in NBA history, that wouldn't give us enough reason to believe the conclusion that he's the greatest player in NBA history. Well, note, the first argument actually did pass this test. So if it's true that either Bush or Clinton was president on 9/11, and if it were true that it was not Bush, then it would have to be the case that it was Clinton. So the first argument passed on this criteria, this test, the proper form test. The second argument did not pass the proper form test. So if the answer is no to the first question, you know you have a bad argument, because even if the claims are true, you wouldn't have enough support. But if the answer to this question is yes, then you need to ask a further question. Are the premises in fact true? So when we talked about the first argument, we said premise 2 in the first argument was just false. It was just false that Bush was not president on 9/11. So while it passed the proper form test, it did not pass the true premise test. The second argument we looked at, it probably had a true premise. Steph is probably the greatest shooter in NBA history. But the problem with that argument was that even if the premise were true, which I contend and many experts contend that it is, that's not enough to believe the conclusion. So that argument had the opposite problem. So if an argument is good, then the answer to both of these questions will be yes, the premises will be true. And if the premises were true, they would provide enough support for the conclusion. If the answer to either of these questions is no, then the argument's a bad argument. It shouldn't justify the conclusion in our minds. Now, one thing I want to note here is there can be a lot of debate about whether or not premises of an argument should be considered true, and whether or not we should think that if they're true, they give us enough reason to believe the conclusion. But what I do want to say is almost all criticisms of an argument can be reduced down to one of these two problems. So I encourage you, especially as you're looking at chapter 1 in our ethics text, or as you're thinking about the trolley problem arguments that you presented and some of the discussion about those trolley problems, think about if the criticisms you had of others' arguments, or if the criticisms that people had of your arguments can be narrowed down to attacks on the truth of a premise, or even if the premises were true, would they give us enough reason to believe the conclusion? So these are sort of conversation starters, and especially if we don't know how to criticize an argument, ask these two questions of the argument. Focus on the premises. Note, there isn't a single question here that's directly about the conclusion. We don't directly evaluate the conclusion because if we do just directly go to the conclusion, we're ignoring the argument that somebody's trying to provide us to justify the conclusion to us. So we shouldn't skip over the argument and go directly to the conclusion. Let's give the argument its fair day in court. It's fair, or do our due diligence to see if the argument would lead us to believe a conclusion, even if we think it's initially controversial. So let's look at some example arguments and apply these two tests. So the first example, London is north of Paris. London is south of Edinburgh. Therefore, Paris is south of Edinburgh. Two premises here, and then the conclusion. So first, let's ask the question, remember the proper form test. If these premises are true, would they give us good reason to believe the conclusion? Well, if it were true, that London is north of Paris, so Paris is south of London. And if it were true that London is south of Edinburgh, so Edinburgh is north of London, then the picture the premises paint is Paris is furthermost south, then London is north of Paris, and Edinburgh is north of London. So then the conclusion says, therefore, we should think that Paris, again, what we said, the premises paint as the southernmost of the three cities, is south of Edinburgh, which the picture of the premises paint is that it's the northernmost city. So if those premises are true, it seems that we have to believe the conclusion, with that key qualification, if the premises are true. So what would we say about the form of this argument? This argument passes the proper form test. If those premises are true, we should believe the conclusion. Then we have to ask the follow-up question, are the premises in fact true? So how would we know that? Well, if we've never been to those cities, if we don't have the relevant background knowledge, then we would just Google the answer to this. One way you could do it is just by looking at a map of Europe. So let's do that real quick. Unfortunately, this map does not have Edinburgh, but we see on this map, here's London, sort of in the southern part of the UK here. Here's Paris, further south in France. So London is north of Paris. So premise one is true. And if Edinburgh was on this map, then we would find it up here in the northern part of the United Kingdom. So we would see that premise two is also true, that London is south of Edinburgh. So we would see that both premises are true. So then we'd see that this argument passes the true premise test. So what have we said of this argument in sum? We've said if the premises are true, they give us good reason to believe the conclusion, and the premises are in fact true. So we have good reason to believe this conclusion, that Paris is south of Edinburgh. So good argument, passes both tests, good argument. Let's look at another example. So Moby Dick was written by Shakespeare. Moby Dick is a science fiction novel, therefore Shakespeare wrote at least one science fiction novel. And let's just go through these questions again. So first, the proper form test. If these premises are true, would they give us good reason to believe the conclusion? So if it were true that Moby Dick was written by Shakespeare, if it were true that Moby Dick is a science fiction novel, would that give us good reason to believe that Shakespeare wrote at least one science fiction novel? Yes. In fact, if those premises are true, they would give us all the reason we need to know that Shakespeare wrote at least one science fiction novel, if they're true. So this passes the proper form test. But then we have to ask ourselves, are these premises in fact true? Was Moby Dick written by Shakespeare? No, that's false. Moby Dick was written by Herman Melville. If you didn't have the background knowledge, again, you could just look it up online. And the second premise, Moby Dick is a science fiction novel, that unfortunately is also false. Moby Dick is a boring novel about whaling that I've tried to get through many times, but unfortunately I just can't do it. I hear it's a great novel. I just can't get into it for whatever reason. But it's not a science fiction novel. Maybe I could get into it better if it was a science fiction novel. In any event, both of these premises are false. Moby Dick was not written by Shakespeare. It's not a science fiction novel. So while this passed the proper form test, it fails the true premise test, so it doesn't provide us good reason to believe the conclusion. One thing to note here, even if just one of the premises were false, it would fail the it would fail the true premises test. Another example, constructing the Great Pyramid at Giza required lifting massive stone blocks to great heights. Therefore, the ancient Egyptians probably had some magical anti-gravity device. So first, the proper form test. Constructing the Great Pyramid at Giza required lifting massive stone blocks to great heights. That's true. It's remarkable how big those stones are, and we may wonder, how did they ever get those stones up there? So the premise is true. They had to lift those massive stones to great heights. So then, given that the premise is true, I guess we reverse the questions here. So it's past the true premise test, but then we also have to ask, if the premise is true, which we found it was, would that give us good enough reason to believe the conclusion? So given that they had to lift these stones to massive heights, would that be good enough reason to believe that they had a magical anti-gravity device? Probably not. There are certainly other more reasonable explanations, more likely explanations for how they could have lifted the massive stones to great heights. Again, if you don't have the relevant background knowledge, this is some research you can do. How did the ancient Egyptians lift these massive stones to great heights? What you won't find is that they had some magical anti-gravity device. You'll find ingenious methods for mechanical methods for manipulating stones and lifting them, and a ton of slave labor. You won't find magical anti-gravity devices. So while the premise is true, it does not give us good enough reason to believe the argument, so it fails the proper form test. All right, so that brings us to our quiz questions. There are going to be 3 quiz questions. So yeah, I'll just jump into it. Consider the following argument. Either Shaun White or Scott Lago won an Olympic gold medal in 2010. Shaun White did not win one in 2010. Thus, Scott Lago did win a gold medal in 2010. So I'm going to ask you, does this pass the good form test, or the proper form test as we were calling it? Oh, that's a mess. Let me change that really quick. Does this pass the proper form test? And does this pass the true premise test? Sorry for the conclusion, or sorry for the confusion there. All right, so again, either Shaun White or Scott Lago won an Olympic gold medal in 2010. Shaun White did not win one in 2010, thus Scott Lago did. So you have to ask yourself those 2 questions again. If those premises are true, would they give us enough reason to believe the conclusion? And are those premises in fact true? One of these answers must be true, because it gives you all combinations there. So does it pass both tests? Does it fail one and pass the other? Or does it fail both? If you don't have the background knowledge, again, you can look this information up really easily online. The second quiz question. Consider the following argument. The Department of Defense building outside Washington, D.C. has the shape of a hexagon. Therefore, it has 7 sides. So A premise and A conclusion. And we're going to ask the same question about this one. Does it pass the proper form test? Does it pass the true premise test? Does it pass both? Does it pass one and not the other? Or does it fail both? So again, if you don't have the relevant background knowledge, if you don't know what shape the building is, if you don't know how many sides a hexagon is, these are things you can look up. And then you also have to ask yourself, if that premise is true, would it lead to the conclusion? Right? Quiz question number 3. The longest river in South America is the Amazon, and the Amazon flows through Brazil. Therefore, the longest river in South America flows through Brazil. So again, same question. We have two premises here and one conclusion. So we have to ask ourselves, does this, and I'll put the same answer key up here. Does it pass the proper form test? Does it pass the true premise test? Does it fail one and pass the other? Or does it fail both? So go ahead and answer all these three quiz questions in your notes. Note your answer, and when you go to the Canvas quiz, indicate the answer you selected. So, really brief introduction to how to evaluate arguments. When you're reading chapter 1 in the textbook, consider the things we've talked about differentiating the premises from the conclusion of the arguments, and also how we start evaluating arguments in terms of the truth of the premises, and if they're true, would they give us enough to believe the conclusion? I think what you'll find is in chapter 1, if you take some care to separate the premises and conclusion of the arguments presented, and if you start looking at the criticisms of the arguments, you'll see that a lot of them are attacking the truth of various premises in the argument, or if the premises are true, do they give us enough reason to believe the conclusion? So I'll have that lecture up about chapter 1 probably by tomorrow, hopefully by tomorrow morning. In the meantime, you can do this quiz and read chapter 1 and take the chapter 1 reading quiz. Thanks all for watching. I'll see you soon with a lecture about, or you'll see me soon with a lecture about chapter 1. All right, thanks.